August 1942, the war in the Pacific was not going well. Across the vast stretches of ocean, Japanese transport ships were moving almost freely. Every convoy that reached New Guinea meant more troops, more weapons, and more pressure on Allied forces. Already stretched to their limits, the Allies tried to stop them from the air. But nothing was working. From high altitude, bombers dropped their payloads from 15,000 feet. On paper, it looked effective. In reality, it was almost useless. Ships moved, clouds hid targets, bombs splashed into empty water. Convoys sailed on untouched, so pilots tried the opposite approach. They flew lower. That was even worse. At low altitude, bombers became easy targets. Japanese ships were covered in anti-aircraft guns. Deck gunners waited calmly, tracking incoming aircraft, and when the bombers came within range, the sky filled with fire. Aircraft were ripped apart. Crews burned. Entire squadrons disappeared in minutes. The math was brutal. Fly high, miss everything. Fly low, get killed by mid-1942. The 5th Air Force was losing aircraft faster than it could replace them. In some units, losses were so heavy that crews stopped expecting to finish their tours. Every mission felt like borrowed time. Commanders knew the situation was unsustainable. Japanese reinforcements were pouring into New Guinea, island by island, convoy by convoy. If nothing changed, the entire Southwest Pacific campaign could collapse. But the problem wasn't bravery, it wasn't training, and it wasn't effort. The problem was the bomber itself. These aircraft had been designed for one thing: dropping bombs from altitude. They were never meant to fight ships at point-blank range. Their nose guns were weak, their tactics were outdated, and their crews were being asked to do the impossible with the wrong tools. Some officers accepted this as the cost of war. One man didn't. While others debated new bombing patterns and higher altitudes, he was looking at the aircraft itself, not as a bomber, but as something else entirely, something far more dangerous, something no engineer had designed, no manual had approved, and no commander had officially asked for. The solution, if it existed at all, would not come from headquarters. It would come from desperation, and from one man willing to turn a bomber into a weapon no one believed could work. Paul Irvin Gunn was not supposed to change the war. He wasn't a famous ace, he wasn't a general. He wasn't even supposed to be flying combat missions anymore. At 43 years old, Gunn was already considered old by wartime standards. Most pilots his age were behind desks, training younger men or managing paperwork. Gunn had already spent more than 2 decades in uniform, first in the Navy, then in the Army Air Forces. He knew engines better than most mechanics and aircraft better than most pilots. But what truly separated him from others was how he thought Gunn didn't see airplanes the way mandrels described them. He saw them as machines, imperfect, adaptable, and capable of becoming something else if pushed hard enough before the war. He had been a civilian airline builder in the Philippines. He didn't just fly planes, he maintained them, repaired them, and modified them to survive harsh conditions. Jungle heat, rough runways, bad weather. If something broke, Gunn didn't wait for instructions. He fixed it. That mindset followed him into the war. But there was another reason Gunn refused to accept failure. His wife and 4 children were trapped behind enemy lines. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in early 1942, Gunn's family was captured and sent to the St. Tomas internment camp in Manila. They were civilians. They had no protection, no guarantee of survival. Food was scarce, disease was common. Every month that passed meant more danger. Gunn knew this. Every mission he flew, every aircraft he worked on carried that weight. This was not about medals or promotion. This was about ending the war faster, about breaking Japanese supply lines, about getting closer to the Philippines and to his family around him. Bomber crews were dying, using tactics that clearly did not work. Gunn watched aircraft fail, not because pilots lacked courage, but because the aircraft were being used the wrong way to gun. This was unacceptable. He didn't blame the crews. He didn't blame bad luck. He blamed design. Bombers, he believed, were being treated as fragile delivery trucks instead of weapons. They flew predictable paths. They attacked from expected angles. And Japanese gunners had learned exactly how to kill them. If the enemy could predict you, you were already dead. Gunn believed survival depended on surprise, violence, and speed, not altitude. While others focused on bombs, Gunn focused on guns. He asked a simple question no one else seemed willing to ask. What if a bomber didn't try to avoid enemy fire? What if it crushed it? If an aircraft could pour overwhelming fire straight ahead, it could silence deck guns before they had time to react. If it could survive the approach, it could attack ships from point-blank range, close enough that missing would be impossible. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and according to every rule of aircraft design, it was a terrible idea. But war did not care about rules, and Paul Gunn was running out of time. The idea didn't come from a classroom. It came from watching bombs miss. Again and again, Gunn saw the same thing happen. Bombers would line up, release their payloads perfectly, and watch the bombs fall harmlessly into the sea while ships kept moving. Hitting a moving target from high altitude was closer to gambling than science. But Gunn had seen something different. Pilots flying low over water noticed that when bombs were released at the right angle, they didn't sink immediately. They skipped, just like a stone thrown across a lake. The bomb would hit the water, bounce, once or twice, slam into the side of a ship, and explode near or below the waterline, exactly where ships were most vulnerable. This was skip bombing. It wasn't new, but it was dangerous. To make it work, aircraft had to fly straight at a ship, barely 50 feet above the waves, holding course until the last possible second. That approach was usually fatal. Japanese ships were packed with anti-aircraft guns. As soon as a bomber came in low deck, gunners had a perfect shot. Aircraft were torn apart before they could even release their bombs, so skip bombing had a fatal flaw. You could hit the ship, but you probably wouldn't survive long enough to try. Gunn understood the problem immediately. The issue wasn't the bomb, it was the approach. If an aircraft could reach the release point alive, skip bombing would work every time. The real challenge was suppressing the ship's defenses before they could react, and that meant guns, not defensive guns, not tail turrets, forward firepower. Most bombers carried a few small caliber guns in the nose, mainly for deterrence. They weren't designed to destroy hardened targets. Against ships, those rounds barely mattered. They sparked off metal and did little damage to gun crews. Protected by shields and armor, Gunn knew this because he'd seen it. If the aircraft was going to survive the approach, it needed heavier weapons, guns powerful enough to shred gun positions, smash bridges, and kill crews instantly. That meant .50 caliber machine guns. These were fighter weapons, heavy, powerful, and brutally effective. A single burst could tear through steel, flesh, and equipment. 4 of them firing together could turn a ship's deck into a killing zone. The problem was weight. Each .50 caliber gun was heavy. The ammunition was even heavier. Bombers weren't designed to carry that much mass in the nose. Add too much forward, weight and the aircraft would become unstable, unable to climb, or impossible to control. Engineers avoided this for a reason, but Gunn wasn't thinking like an engineer. He was thinking like a man who had watched too many crews die. He believed that if an aircraft could overwhelm a ship's defenses in the first few seconds of the attack, everything else would fall into place. Deck gunners would die at their posts. Fire control would collapse. Bombs could be dropped at point-blank range. The attack would be fast, violent, and decisive. To Gunn, the risk was clear. Either they changed how bombers fought, or they would keep losing men for nothing. The idea was dangerous. It was unapproved, and if it failed, it would likely kill the pilot testing it. But for Gunn, that was no longer a reason to stop. It was a reason to start. The aircraft Gunn chose for his experiment was the Douglas A-20 Havoc. It was fast, tough, and already used for low-level attacks. But it had a problem. Its nose guns were weak for small-caliber machine guns that barely scratched ship armor. For Gunn's idea to work, those guns had to be replaced. So he did something radical. He removed the bombardier entirely, where a man once lay guiding. Gunn ordered mechanics to weld steel mounts for 4.50 caliber machine guns. These weren't new weapons. They were stripped from wrecked fighter planes, aircraft that would never fly again. The pilots were dead. The guns were not. Each gun weighed over 60 pounds. The ammunition added even more. By the time everything was installed, hundreds of pounds had been added to the very front of the aircraft. The center of gravity shifted dangerously forward. On paper, the aircraft was already wrong. The first test flight nearly proved the engineers right. As the A-20 lifted off the runway, it immediately tried to nose down. The pilot fought the controls just to keep it airborne. Climb was sluggish. Stability was poor. One mistake would have driven the aircraft straight into the ground. The pilot survived. Barely. Gun didn't argue with the results. He worked on them for 2 days straight. He and his crew rebalanced the aircraft. Equipment was moved aft. Trim settings were adjusted. Anything that could be shifted was shifted. Every small change mattered. The second test flight was still dangerous. The pilot later said the aircraft flew like it was angry, heavy on the controls, unstable, and unforgiving. But this time, it flew. That was enough. In September 1942, 16 modified A-20s were sent on a real mission. Their target was a Japanese airfield at Buna. The approach was low, treetop level. No gentle climb, no defensive circling. They came in fast. As the aircraft roared toward the field, the new guns opened fire. The sound was different now, deeper, heavier, continuous. Gun positions were smashed before crews could react. Aircraft on the ground burned where they sat. 14 Japanese planes were destroyed. Not a single F-20 was lost. Low-level attack worked exactly as Gun had imagined. The guns didn't just protect the aircraft, they dominated the battlefield. Commanders took notice immediately, but Gun wasn't satisfied. The A-20 had limits. Its range was short. Its bomb load was small. It couldn't reach deeper targets across the mountains and sea. To truly cut Japanese supply lines, Gun needed a larger aircraft. A bomber with more space, more power, and far more guns he needed. The B-25 Mitchell. The attack on Buna changed everything until then. Low-level attacks had been seen as desperate gambles. The losses were too high, the results too uncertain. But what the modified A-20s had just done could not be ignored. They had flown straight into danger and survived. For the first time, commanders saw proof that overwhelming forward firepower could neutralize enemy defenses before those defenses had time to react. The aircraft were no longer victims. They were hunters. The lesson was clear. If bombers could dominate the approach, they could dominate the target. Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots talked, ground crews talked, commanders talked, and one name kept coming up: Gun. But success came with a warning. The A-20 Havoc had done its job, but it was not the final answer. Its range was too limited to reach the most important Japanese supply routes. Its bomb load was too small to destroy larger convoys, and its airframe had little room for further expansion. If this new way of fighting was going to matter, it had to scale. That meant a bigger aircraft. The B-25 Mitchell was the obvious choice. It had longer range. It could carry heavier bombs. And, most importantly, it had space. When Gun first walked around the B-25, he didn't see a bomber. He saw potential, a solid nose, a strong fuselage, room for guns, ammunition, and more modifications than engineers would ever approve on paper. So once again, Gun ignored tradition. The bombardier position was removed. The glass nose was replaced with solid structure. Into that space went for 50 caliber machine guns. Then more were added to the sides of the fuselage. The top turret was rotated forward, allowing it to fire into the attack path. 10 forward-firing guns, then Gun added more. By the time he was done, the aircraft carried 14 guns aimed straight ahead. When all of them fired together, they poured an unbelievable amount of lead forward, more firepower than some destroyers could bring to bear. The ground crews had a name for it. They called it Pepe's Folly. They weren't mocking Gun, they were scared. The aircraft was nose-heavy. On takeoff, it wanted to drop straight back onto the runway. Pilots had to pull hard just to keep it level. If the engines failed, there would be no recovery. But once airborne, the B-25 became something else entirely. It was fast, it was stable, and it was terrifying. When Gun demonstrated the aircraft to combat units, skepticism turned into silence. Pilots, who had buried friends after failed low-level attacks, now saw an aircraft that could fight back. Commanders wanted more. Orders were placed immediately, Conversion teams worked around the clock. Every available B-25 was stripped, reinforced, and armed. By early 1943, dozens of these modified aircraft were ready for combat. But far from the front lines, in offices thousands of miles away, engineers were preparing to shut it all down. They were about to declare guns creation impossible. The B-25 was never meant to fight like this. It had been designed as a medium bomber, balanced, predictable, and safe by engineering standards. Gun was turning it into something violent and unbalanced on purpose. Every new gun added power. Every new gun added risk. With 14 forward-firing machine guns, the aircraft's nose became brutally heavy. On takeoff, pilots had seconds to react. Too slow on the controls, and the aircraft would drop out of the sky before it ever reached combat. Gunn knew this. That's why he flew the prototype himself. He didn't trust the numbers. He trusted feel. He trusted experience. And he trusted that if the aircraft could survive takeoff and climb, it would be unstoppable in the attack. The first demonstrations were tense. Pilots watched as Gunn forced the aircraft into the air, holding full back pressure just to keep the nose from falling. Once airborne, the B-25 stabilized. At speed, the weight that nearly killed it on takeoff became an advantage. The aircraft punched through turbulence. The gun platform was solid. When Gunn opened fire, the effect was shocking. 14 guns fired at once, turning the air in front of the aircraft into a solid wall of bullets. Nothing exposed could survive that kind of fire. Deck guns, bridges, crew positions, all erased in seconds. The madness worked. General commanders didn't ask for engineering reports. They asked for more aircraft. Conversion teams were ordered to modify every B-25 they could get their hands on. Mechanics worked 18-hour shifts. Aircraft came in as bombers and left as strafers, heavier, louder, and far deadlier than anything flown before. By February 1943, nearly 30 modified B-25s were ready for combat. That's when the message arrived from the United States. Army engineers had studied the blueprints Gunn sent back for approval. They reviewed the weight, the balance, the structural stress. They reached a unanimous conclusion. The aircraft should never fly. They warned that the center of gravity was wrong, that the fuselage would fatigue, that recoil forces would damage the airframe. They recommended grounding every modified B-25 immediately. On paper, they were right. In reality, the aircraft were already flying, and they were about to be tested. In the most important battle of the Pacific War so far, one that would decide whether Gunn's madness was genius or a deadly mistake. The message from the United States was clear, confident, and final. The modified B-25 was unsafe. The balance was wrong. The aircraft was too heavy. The stress on the airframe would cause failure. The recommendation was blunt. Ground every modified aircraft immediately. The engineers had done their job. They had followed rules, calculations, and design limits. On paper, Gunn's aircraft violated almost all of them, but war was not fought on paper. By the time the message arrived in Australia, the modified B-25s were already operational. Crews were training, ammunition was loaded, bombs were stacked. On the tarmac, the aircraft were days away from combat. The man who had to answer the engineers was General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenney had seen the problem firsthand. He had watched bombers fail again and again using approved tactics. He had watched crews die while doing everything right, and now, for the first time, he had something that worked. Kenney did not reply with arguments. He replied with results. He informed Washington that the aircraft would not be grounded. Not now, not before combat, not when the enemy was moving thousands of troops by sea. If the engineers were right, the aircraft would fail soon enough. If they were wrong, the war might change. There would be no more debate. While engineers prepared reports explaining why the aircraft should never have been built, Kenney prepared something else entirely. A battle Japanese intelligence had been intercepted. A large convoy was moving toward New Guinea, carrying thousands of troops and supplies. If it reached its destination, Allied ground forces would face disaster. Kenney had a narrow window to stop it. 72 hours? This would not be a test mission. This would not be a demonstration. This would be the moment when Gunn's impossible aircraft either justified its existence or proved the engineers right in the worst possible way. The Japanese convoy left Rabaul at the end of February 19, 43.8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, nearly 7,000 troops. Their destination was New Guinea's north coast. If they arrived, Japanese ground forces would be reinforced at a critical moment. Allied positions would be threatened. The balance of the campaign could tilt overnight. Japanese commanders were confident. They believed the weather would protect them. March was monsoon season. Low clouds, heavy rain, poor visibility, conditions that made accurate bombing almost impossible. High altitude? Bombers would struggle to see targets. Low-level attacks would be suicidal in rough weather. The convoy sailed straight into the storm. Allied codebreakers knew exactly where it was going. General Kenny had limited options and even less time. He had 3 days to stop the convoy before it reached safety. He couldn't wait for perfect conditions. He couldn't wait for reinforcements. He had to use what he had, and what he had was guns, strafers. On March 2nd, reconnaissance aircraft finally spotted the convoy moving south through the Vidya Strait. High-altitude bombers were sent in. First, flying fortresses attacked from 15,000 feet through gaps in the clouds. Bombs fell. Water erupted. Crews reported hits. But when the smoke cleared, nothing had sunk. It was the same story again. The convoy kept moving. That night, Japanese ships changed formation. Transports hugged the coast. Destroyers spread out to screen them. Commanders believed they would reach their destination by dawn. They had no idea what was waiting for them at first light. At Port Moresby, crews were briefed late into the night. The plan was simple and terrifying. High-altitude bombers would attack first, drawing defensive fire upward. Then, at wavetop height, the strafers would come in low, so low their propellers would almost touch the water. They would not maneuver. They would not break formation. They would fly straight into gunfire. The goal was total suppression. Kill the deck crews, silence the guns, skip the bombs into the holes. Get out before enemy fighters arrived. It was a plan built on seconds. If the guns worked, the convoy would die. If they didn't, the sky would fill with burning aircraft. No one slept that night. Dawn broke on March 3, 1943. Under low clouds and rain, the strike force assembled over the coast, more than 100 aircraft forming up in rough weather. High above, the heavy bombers moved into position. Below them, almost invisible against the sea, the strafers waited. The high-altitude attack came first. Flying fortresses pushed through the clouds and released their bombs. Black bursts filled the sky as Japanese ships opened fire. Every gun pointed upward. Every crew focused on the threat above them. That was the moment the strafers were waiting for. They came in low, so low that spray kicked up behind their propellers. 12 modified B-25s flew in tight formation, line abreast, a moving wall of aircraft. Each one carried 14 forward-firing guns. Together, they brought nearly 200 machine guns worth of firepower crashing toward the convoy. The Japanese crews saw them too late. At less than a mile out, the B-25s opened fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. Streams of .50 caliber rounds skipped across the water and climbed onto the ships. Gun shields shattered. Crew positions vanished. Bridges were ripped apart before orders could be given. Deck guns went silent one by one as the strafers closed to point-blank range. Bombs were released. They hit the water, bounced, and slammed into the hulls just above the waterline. Explosions tore through engine rooms and fuel tanks. Ships slowed, then stopped, then burned. One transport was dead in under a minute. Another tried to turn away, pushing its engines beyond limits. It didn't matter. The strafers were faster. They came in from both sides, raking the deck until nothing moved. Bombs followed. The ship broke apart and vanished beneath the waves in minutes. Japanese sailors and soldiers jumped into the sea wearing full gear. Many never resurfaced. The strafers didn't circle. They didn't linger. They hit, released, and disappeared at full speed by the time the Japanese realized what had happened. The convoy was already breaking apart, and this was only the first pass by mid-morning. The Japanese convoy was no longer a convoy. It was debris spread across miles of ocean. 5 transports were already burning or sinking. 2 destroyers were crippled, dead in the water. Smoke columns marked every successful hit, rising through the low clouds like signal fires. The surviving ships tried to escape. They scattered in different directions, pushing engines to their limits, hoping speed or weather would save them. It didn't. The strafers returned in the afternoon. This time there was no fighter cover waiting for them. Japanese aircraft had landed to refuel and rearm. The sky over the convoy was empty. The second attack was systematic. Each ship was hunted. Individually, strafers came in low and fast, raking decks until resistance collapsed. Bombs followed, skipping cleanly into hulls already weakened by earlier hits. Some ships exploded, others burned until they rolled over and vanished beneath the waves. One transport took so many bomb hits that its magazine detonated. The explosion was visible from over 100 miles away. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No wreckage, no survivors. Destroyers attempting rescue were attacked next. Focused on pulling men from the water, their crews never saw the strafers coming. Gunfires swept their decks. Bombs struck bridges and engine spaces. One by one, the escorts were silenced by the end of the day. The ocean was littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and survivors clinging to debris. Allied aircraft continued to attack until there were no organized targets left by nightfall on March 3rd. The result was undeniable. The entire convoy had been destroyed. 8 transport ships sunk. For destroyers, sunk or later lost. Thousands of troops never reached shore. Allied losses were minimal. The battle was over, and with it, the argument the aircraft that engineers had called impossible had just annihilated a major Japanese reinforcement. Force in broad daylight, the war in the Southwest Pacific had changed permanently. The destruction of the convoy sent shockwaves through both sides of the war. For the Japanese, it was a disaster they could not hide. Thousands of troops had been lost at sea. Ships that were supposed to reinforce New Guinea were gone. Survivors spoke of aircraft that came in so low and fast they could not be stopped. For the Allies, it was confirmation high-altitude bombing against moving ships had failed. Low-level attack with overwhelming firepower had worked decisively. The engineers' warnings arrived too late to matter. When reports of the battle reached Washington, they included a detail that ended the debate instantly. 12 of the modified B-25s, the same aircraft engineers had declared unfit to fly, had played a central role in destroying the convoy. No calculations were needed after that. The aircraft were not grounded. They were ordered into mass production. General Kenney personally shut down further objections. He informed senior leadership that dozens more strafers were already being modified in the field. Any attempt to stop the program would only slow a weapon that had proven its worth in combat. The strategic impact was immediate. Japanese commanders abandoned daylight convoy operations. Reinforcements could no longer move safely by sea. Supplies had to be rerouted, delayed, or carried in smaller, less efficient ways. Time, the one thing Japan could not afford to lose, was now working against them. The Pacific campaign would not collapse, and all of it traced back to a single change in thinking. Bombers were no longer just bomb carriers. They were weapons in their own right. What began as a desperate field modification was now impossible to ignored the United States Army Air Forces, made a decision that rarely happened in wartime aviation. Instead of redesigning the idea, they adopted it. Paul Gunn was sent to California to show factory engineers exactly how the strafers worked, not in theory, but in reality. The engineers asked for calculations. Gunn gave them experience. They asked about stress limits. He showed them where metal had cracked and how he had reinforced it. They asked about recoil and balance. He showed them how he had shifted equipment and adjusted trim to compensate. Slowly, reluctantly, the impossible design was turned into an official one. The first factory-built version was the B-25G. Its glass nose was replaced with solid armor. 4.50 caliber machine guns were mounted forward. And then came something new, a 75mm cannon installed in the nose. A weapon normally mounted on tanks, one shot from that cannon could tear open a ship's hull. The recoil was violent. The entire aircraft shuddered with each firing. Reloading was slow, but against ships, it worked. More importantly, it proved the concept could evolve. The next version, the B-25H, refined the design. More guns were added to the cheek mounts. The turret was optimized for forward fire. Recoil systems were improved. The aircraft became more controllable, more lethal, and easier for crews to use in combat. Then came the B-25J. It removed the cannon and replaced it with even more machine guns, up to 18 firing forward. It became the most heavily armed production bomber of the war. By late 1943, thousands of B-25s were rolling off assembly lines. Nearly half of them carried forward-firing gun packages based on Gunn's original idea, what had once been mocked, as Pappy's folly was now standard doctrine, and it wasn't limited to the Pacific. Other theaters copied the concept. Modified bombers hunted ships in the Mediterranean. Supply lines were attacked in Burma. The idea spread because it worked, not because it was elegant, but because it was effective. The strafer was no longer an experiment, it was a weapon. While the strafer spread across the Pacific, Paul Gunn's own war was catching up with him. He had never stopped flying. Despite his age and his role as a special projects officer, Gunn continued to take part in combat missions. He wanted to see how the aircraft performed in real conditions. He wanted to understand their limits. And above all, he wanted to stay close to the front dot. Every mission brought him closer to the Philippines, but war has a way of collecting its debts. In late 1944, Japanese bombers struck an Allied airfield before Dunk. Gunn was on the ground, reviewing mission plans, when the first bombs hit. The blast threw him to the ground. Shrapnel tore through the area. Fragments struck his leg and shoulder. The wounds were serious. One piece of shrapnel severed an artery in his leg. Blood loss was heavy. Medics stopped the bleeding just in time. Doctors told him the truth. He would not fly again for months, possibly never. The injury qualified him for medical retirement. After more than 2 decades of service, no one would have questioned it. Gunn refused. He told the surgeons he would recover. He told his commanders he would return to duty. And privately, he told himself something else. He was not finished until his family was free. Reports from Manila were getting worse. Food rations at the Santo Tomas internment camp had been cut again. Disease was spreading. Prisoners were dying of malnutrition and untreated illness. Gunn knew that if the war dragged on, his family might not survive it. So while his body healed slowly, his mind stayed in the fight. He reviewed aircraft modifications from his hospital bed. He sent notes to crews. He followed every operation that pushed Allied forces closer to the Philippines. The strafers were still flying. Other pilots, other crews, but his aircraft and every ship they sank, every supply line they cut, shortened the war by a little more. Time was still the enemy in February 1945. American forces entered Manila. The battle for the city was brutal. Street by street, building by building, the fighting dragged on. Japanese commanders had declared Manila a fortress. Civilians were trapped in the middle. Prisoners inside internment camps waited, not knowing whether liberation or execution would come first. On February 3rd, American troops reached the gates of Santo Tomas. Inside the camp were thousands of prisoners, civilians, who had been held for nearly 3 years. Many could barely stand. Most were malnourished. Disease had spread unchecked. Some had not seen a full meal in months. Among them were Paul, Gunn's wife and children. They were alive. His wife weighed less than 90 pounds. His children were thin, weak, and exhausted. One had malaria. Another was suffering from dysentery, but they had survived. The next day, against medical orders, Gunn flew to Manila. His leg was still bandaged. He walked with a cane. Doctors had cleared him only for light duty, no combat flying, no strain. He ignored most of it. When he reached the camp, he didn't arrive as a hero. There were no announcements, no ceremony. He walked quietly into a makeshift hospital set up for former prisoners. At first, his wife didn't recognize him. 3 years had changed them both. He had lost weight. His hair had gone completely gray. His face was harder, older. She thought he was a doctor coming to check on patients. Then he spoke. Her name, that was enough. They had 4 hours together. 4 hours after 3 years of separation, fear, and uncertainty. 4 hours to see that their children were alive. 4 hours to understand that the war, for them, was finally ending. Then Gunn left. His medical leave was not over. The fighting was not over, and he believed with everything he had left that his place was still with the men flying his aircraft. The reunion was brief, but it was enough. The war did not slow down after Manila. Neither did the Strafers by 1944. The modified B-25s were no longer experimental weapons. They were the backbone of Allied air power in the Southwest Pacific. Crews knew exactly how to use them. Tactics had evolved. Coordination between units was precise. The Strafers hunted constantly, attacked supply barges moving along coastlines. They hit harbors at dawn and dusk. They struck airfields, destroying aircraft before they could take off. When daylight became too dangerous, the Strafers adapted again. They learned to attack at night. Using radar and careful timing, B-25s flew, at wavetop height, in complete darkness. PT boats illuminated targets at the last possible moment. Searchlights snapped on. Guns opened fire. Bombs skipped across black water into unseen hulls. Japanese commanders called the aircraft the Black Death. They stopped moving supplies by day. Then they stopped moving them by night. It didn't help. In the first 8 months of 1944 alone, Strafers destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground and sank hundreds of ships. Entire supply networks collapsed. Isolated garrisons starved. Reinforcements arrived too late or not at all. Modified B-25 had become more than a bomber. It was a system. High-altitude bombers forced defenders to look up. Strafers came in low. Fighters cleared the sky. By the time gunners realized what was happening, it was already over. Paul Gunn no longer flew combat missions. His injuries made that impossible. But his influence was everywhere. Aircraft carried modifications he had designed days before missions. Crews flew tactics he had developed through trial and loss. The weapon never stopped evolving, and neither did the pressure on Japan. When the war finally ended, Paul Gunn did not celebrate the way others did. There were no victory parades for him, no long speeches, no sense of closure. The war had taken too much, and it had ended too late for that. His injuries never fully healed. The leg wound ended his combat career for good. In 1948, after more than 25 years of service, Gunn retired from the military as a full colonel. He was 48 years old, but he did not stop working. Before the war, Gunn had built an airline in the Philippines. It had been small, fragile, and full of promise. The Japanese invasion destroyed it completely. Aircraft were seized or destroyed. Routes vanished overnight. After the war, Gunn returned to Manila and started again. He found 3 surplus transport aircraft and began flying basic routes between Philippine cities. There were no luxuries, no guarantees, just the same mindset that had guided him during the war. Fix what's broken. Adapt to reality. Keep moving. Slowly, the airline grew. New aircraft were added. Routes expanded. What had once been a tiny operation became a national carrier again. Within a few years, Philippine Airlines was flying internationally, connecting a country rebuilding itself after years of occupation. This time, Gunn wasn't designing weapons. He was rebuilding lives. Paul Gunn never learned how to stop. Flying had kept him alive during the war. Movement had meant survival. Even in peace, standing still felt wrong. In October 1957, Gunn chartered a small twin-engine aircraft for a routine flight in the Philippines. It was a short trip, one he had made many times before. The weather forecast showed scattered storms over the mountains. Nothing unusual, nothing that worried him. He filed his flight plan and took off on schedule. As the aircraft climbed, conditions worsened faster than expected. Clouds closed in. Rain reduced visibility. Turbulence increased. Radio contact became difficult. Then it stopped entirely. Search teams found the wreckage days later on a mountainside. The aircraft had flown into severe weather and struck the ridge while trying to climb above it. There were no survivors. Paul Gunn died at 57 years old. The man who had survived combat, experimentation, and war was lost on an ordinary flight in peacetime. The Philippines held a state funeral. Thousands attended veterans, airline workers, former prisoners from the camps his aircraft had helped liberate. Speeches spoke of medals, service records, and rank. None of them fully captured who he had been. Paul Gunn's aircraft did not disappear when the war ended. The idea behind them survived. Before gun bombers were tools of distance. They dropped weapons and left. Precision depended on altitude, formation, and luck. After Gun, aircraft became something else: adaptable platforms that could strike directly, aggressively, and repeatedly. The Strafer changed how air forces thought. Bombers could suppress defenses, they could support ground forces, they could hunt ships, vehicles, and airfields at close range. This way of fighting shaped everything that followed. Gunships used in later wars carried the same logic: forward firepower, overwhelming suppression, staying on target instead of passing over it. Modern attack aircraft trace their lineage back to the moment Gun decided a bomber should fight head-on. The lesson wasn't just technical, it was human. Innovation didn't come from committees. It didn't come from perfect data. It came from necessity, from someone close enough to failure to see what had to change. Gun didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for approval. He changed the aircraft because the war demanded it. That mindset still matters, not just in war, but everywhere problems are solved under pressure. When rules no longer fit reality, someone has to be willing to break them carefully, intelligently, and with purpose. Paul Gun did exactly that. Most people have never heard of Paul Gun. His name isn't carved into monuments, his face isn't widely recognized. His story exists mostly in reports, photographs, and memories passed quietly from one generation to the next. But his impact is undeniable. Thousands of aircraft were built using ideas that began in a hot airfield workshop in Australia. Entire campaigns were shaped by weapons engineers, once called impossible. Supply lines collapsed, battles were won, lives were saved. Gun never argued about credit. He never chased rank. He never complained about recognition. He wanted two things: to end the war faster and to bring his family home. He succeeded at both. When the war ended, he rebuilt instead of destroying. When his work was forgotten, he didn't protest. He moved forward the same way he always had: quietly, relentlessly, effectively. This story matters because it reminds us of something easy to forget. History doesn't always turn on famous names or grand speeches. Sometimes it turns on a man under an aircraft wing, welding guns into a space where no one thought they belonged because failure was no longer an option. That was Paul Gun, and that is why his story deserves to be remembered. If you loved this story and want more history that shocks, inspires, and motivates, subscribe to Rising Warfare, like this video, and explore the incredible tales we uncover. More amazing content is coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.